Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
Our guest for today's podcast is Matt Holland. Matt was literally born into community. Born to his parents within the Bruderhof Community in the 1940s, Matt grew up initially in the British countryside, only to be uprooted at the age of 6 when the whole community moved to the tropics of Paraguay in South America. Matt describes a wild and unconventional childhood, cut short at the age of 12 when he and his family returned to Britain and mainstream society. Please join us to listen to Matt's journey from his Bruderhof childhood to founding Lower Shore Farm, a contemporary community near Swindon. Welcome to the Diggers and Dreamers podcast, Matt, and we've been looking forward to speaking to you. I was wondering if you might start us off by just giving us a little bit of history about how you got involved in communal living, but more than that, a little bit about yourself to start with.
Thanks, Kirsten. Nice to be here. How I got involved in communal living, I had no choice in the same way that none of us choose our parents. You know, we're the result of a little biological incident between them. And in my case, in the late 1940s, I was born in a converted hen house between Bridgnorth and Ludlow in Shropshire in a grim winter. And it was a place that had 50 people following Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, where they said we should have all things in common and we should call one another brother and sister and we should live and work together. And I was born into a community which went by the name, and it's still used nowadays, but it has had changes over the years, the Bruderhof, which, because it was started by some German people in the 1920s, it kept that name, and Bruderhof means place of brothers. And interestingly, they used to call one another brother and sister, the members. So anyway, I had no choice. I was born into a community. And what's interesting is that when my father was in his 70s, and my parents went on to have 6 children, he divulged a couple of things. One was, he said, I've just started thinking in my 70s. Up till now, I've responded instinctively to everything. And he was very good at drawing. He was an artist. And then the other thing he said to me, Chappie, he said, if your mother and I had not joined the Bruderhof, you would not have been born, I think, because we had stopped doing, life was so difficult, we had stopped doing what's necessary to have more children. And that was a really, it's always stayed with me that I was the result of my parents joining a community. And it stayed with me.
I don't think I don't even know if I knew that you were born into a community. How interesting. So what a start in life.
What a start in life, but a start in which, I'll repeat, I had no choice. I had no say. You know, most people think of joining a community as something they do by choice. And I've reflected often on that. And not only do we not choose our parents, but we don't choose our siblings. And there's this pressure to love your parents and love your siblings. But the people we actually choose are our friends and our lovers. And in the case of what we're talking about today, our community members and communities we care to join. And whether it's a casual community in an urban street or an intentional community somewhere out in the sticks or something in between, we do usually make a choice when we're adults or when we think we're adults, which is another whole discussion. When does adulthood begin? Certainly not at 16, certainly not at 18, certainly not at 28. I'm starting to try to work out what I'll do with my life now.
I'm not sure I've achieved adulthood yet.
Well, that's great.
It would be really interesting to hear a bit about what it was like to grow up in the Bruderhof community.
Memory can deceive us, of course, and many psychologists and philosophers have said we're in denial about difficult things quite often in order to move forward. And different people have different ways of seeing their past. And I not only disagree and agree with my siblings about community life, but I also agree and disagree with friends I made on the community about what the experience was like. And I was on the community, on the Bruderhof, until the age of 12. And when I was 12, my parents left. So from the age of 12, community living was no longer part of my life until I chose to try to help create a community. And so the question you've just asked me, what was it like living on a community? Well, there's chapter one. Chapter one was 0 to 12. And my memory of it, and it's important to say this is my memory of it, it was absolutely bloody wonderful. I remembered no stranger danger insofar as I felt safe with all adults. And it so happened that I didn't know my paternal grandparents, and my maternal grandparents died in a concentration camp in Theresienstadt. And so I had these grandparent figures on the Bruderhof who were wonderful and kind. And because my parents had so many children and the community expected them to work, I actually spent quite a bit of time, not just with my parents, but with other people's parents. So it wasn't exactly what you might call shared childcare or creche or anything like that. But they did have a kindergarten, they did have a primary school, and they had parents who would look after children. So I grew up thinking everybody was wonderful, and grown-ups were great. And I should tell you here that when I was 6, my parents went to move with the same community to Paraguay. So I went from wearing Wellingtons and gloves to going barefoot in a cotton shirt, literally in 5 weeks, which is how long it took the transatlantic liner to go from Le Havre in Spain to Buenos Aires in South America. And what was interesting, in Paraguay, community life became even better, even more wonderful. Paraguay is a country that when the conquistadors arrived there, and they arrived in that area late because it's a landlocked country in the heart of South America, they said, and they'd already been to areas that are now called Brazil and Chile and so on. And they came to this land which lies between 2 great rivers. And they said, my goodness, the rivers are full of fish. The fruit is always in season. The weather is wonderful. This is paradise. We may not go home. So I only tell you that. And they wrote letters home to their families in Portugal and Spain saying, we think we've arrived in paradise. And I only tell you this by way of saying, to go from a rather chilly farm in Shropshire to this paradisal country where we would swim in rivers, and for a boy of 6, we would climb trees. I learned how to get honey out of trees. I learned how to skin snakes. I learned how to ride horses. It was fabulous. But since then, I've been back, and also my parents told me stories of children dying of malaria and snake bites. But as a child, it doesn't really matter if another child dies, if you're having a good time. That's a dreadful thing to say, but I've recognized as I've got older that grown-ups, the older we get, the more sensitive we are. When we're children, we get over things quite quickly. We're quite brutal in many ways. We're caring, but actually, when a child cries, it stops crying half an hour later. When I cry, I've got problems for a little while, and when you're a grown up, and so life in Paraguay in the community was doubly wonderful. But we must remember it's through the lens of childhood memory, and I know from accounts by adults that there were all sorts of difficulties. But since you're talking to me and you've asked me, I will tell you, life on the community was wonderful.
That does sound amazing. And I'm sure you're absolutely right. I'm sure that there were all sorts of worries about food and security and, diseases. And as you say, death and all those things. But the lens of a child is often quite unique to that child. Even when siblings recount history and family to each other, you would sometimes think that they were different families and different histories, even within family
That's right.
units. Yeah.
That's
So
right.
yeah. No.
Well, even when two different people describe a car accident, it sounds like two different accidents. So the older one gets, the more one realizes that everybody sees what they're able to see, and place an emphasis on what matters to them. For me, childhood in the community was wonderful.
So chapter 1 is Bruderhof, and you said that your parents left the Bruderhof when you were around 12 years old.
Correct.
Okay, so something must have made a huge impact on you. That just the experience of growing up, and having those formative years in the community, to then come out of community must have been quite different.
That's very astute of you to say that, Kirsten. It was really tough. I couldn't understand. I didn't know who Helen Shapiro was. I didn't understand what people were doing with Brill cream on their hair. I didn't understand why they didn't know how to skin a snake or get honey from a tree. We came back to England. It was cold. I was plugged into Malmesbury Grammar School, in a grammar school. My parents didn't have enough money to buy a school uniform, so I had clothes that were slightly odd, and everybody else, all these blonde farmers' sons and daughters, looked at me as if I was an oddity. And I was popular and I had friends, but I was still, and it's been confirmed since by schoolmates now that they're grown up, that I was this odd child who had a funny accent, didn't quite get things, what seemed to be quite bright, but couldn't do algebra, but knew how to skin snakes, and told stories about getting alligators out of rivers, and didn't know anything about the pop charts and things like that. So I was really quite anachronistic. I felt at sea. I did not feel at home, and yet again, as a young person, you survive and you try to fit in. So I have naturally curly hair, and I try to straighten it with an iron. And I don't know, when you iron hair or nylon, it actually goes more crinkly. So one side of my hair would be even more curly than the other side. And I tried to have an accent that they had, talk like the Wiltshire kids talk, like, and all these attempts to fit in. Looking over my life now that I'm older, what I realized the effect that had is kind of put me back 10 years in every sense. People have often said, "Oh, you're not that age, are you?" Being very flattering and saying you look younger than you are. And I'm in my very late 70s now. And I think it's because for 10 years, I wasn't quite functioning properly and I had to recover. And so by the time I was 28, I felt like an 18-year-old. And by the time I was 38, I felt like a 28-year-old.
Absolutely. So you weren't just learning, like obviously you had the language, but you were having to learn cultural norms, or the kind of the social stuff,
That's right.
all of those kind of embedded norms that we all take for granted because we, like you're describing, pop culture, dress, the way people speak to each other, even those sort of really subtle body language, relationships, all of those things. It sounds like you had to kind of relearn all of those in a new context.
And as you know, Kirsten, those things are more important in your teens than at almost any other time of your life. And when the kids at school would push pencils through my curly hair and circle around me, flicking their bottom lips and going hula, 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 and the word racism didn't exist. And I said to the teacher, why are they doing that? And the teacher said, they like you. They only tease people they like. And that was the truth. But as many writers and others have said, a certain kind of suffering either kills you or makes you stronger. So I don't want to be boastful, but I ended up at Oxford a few years later, and many of my schoolmates didn't. And I felt all right in the long run, but it did take me quite a while. And since we're talking about community living, you're right. The key thing was adjusting to this, we used to call it the outside world. And I think parents should beware where and how they bring up their children, because, again, something that's been said many times by many people, the early years are the ones that count. Give me the child before it's 7 and I'll give you the man or the woman. And there's no question that early years make a big impact, and to reshape yourself in later years is quite tricky.
Although there's also the argument, I guess, that if the foundations are laid well, even though your foundations were laid well, it sounds to me as if they were laid in a loving and exciting and stimulating environment, that ultimately, even though you had to make this huge shift culturally into a new world, possibly those foundations had already been well laid, and that set you up to be able to cope sufficiently with that transition.
How lovely to hear you assess my life's foundations. And you're right. My parents were lovely. I had lovely parents, and the Bruderhof members were lovely. And I think you're right. The older I get, the more I realize that actually to be loved and looked after well in early years means you can at least deal with shit that comes along later.
Absolutely.
Or you've got more chance, let's say. You can't necessarily, and of course a lot depends on the character and your own genes and your own health and everything else, of course.
Well, absolutely, yeah, that nature nurture thing. But I think that ultimate faith that not religious faith, but more a faith that that feeling that you have been well loved, not necessarily always in the family sense, but that you have been and are capable of receiving and giving that love is a really important factor. So do you feel that those sort of formative experiences is what drove, because obviously we're talking to you today because because of your links with Lower Shore Farm. So how did Heart One lead to Part Two?
Absolutely. That's chapter 2. You're absolutely right, Kirsten. Some seeds had been sown in those early years where I was attracted, even though I'm a grumpy, solitary sort of person in one sense, because people often said, why don't you join us? And I said, don't feel like it. I actually get a buzz from people living and working together. There's something wonderful about it. But it doesn't mean you need to be on top of one another all the time, or that you know everything about one another. But there's just something about, the many hands make light work. I remember there was a pile of stones here that I tried to move, and I'd try to move them, and the pile just stayed the same size, and I'd move a couple, and weeks went past. And then we had a woof weekend, a working weekend, and there were 9 people, none of whom looked like they'd ever done any manual work. And they were all sort of talking about changing the world, and they didn't have Wellingtons, and they didn't have gloves, and they laughed and they talked a lot. And you know what? We made it the first job in the morning, and before tea break, the pile of stones was gone, and we'd had a bloody good time together. And that's an example of what one of the many things that communal living brings to you. But some seeds had clearly been sown by the Bruderhof in me, and I inhabited this world of education, and I worked in export for a company, and I went to different parts of the world. And always I felt, I've earned some money, but what? I've got a car, so what? I'm pursuing excitement, so what? Something's missing. And I became interested in my 20s in looking for a community. And I went and I'd visit the teachers. And you remember the teachers? And I thought,
Are these the ones that were they based in Bangor,
it's a Bangor, yeah.
North Wales?
Had a guy called Kevin who was, yeah. Um, and there was elements I liked about them, but they weren't quite right. I went to visit other places. I won't name them all, but I was checking these places out, and then my mother and my sister said to me, you know, there's an old farm near where we live, and we came back from South America and settled in Wiltshire, thanks to my brother working on a farm, and we got a tied cottage as a result of that. And I had a lot to do with farm work in my school holidays, so I went from skinning snakes to milking cows, and keeping chickens, and I loved it. And this was one of a number of farms that my sister and my mother mentioned to me, where with a friend I'd got into contract baling, and when I was 17 or 18, and we would go around with a tractor and a baler and bale the hay for the farmers. And so I got to know the farms around North Wiltshire, and I'd heard that by compulsory purchase, Swindon Borough Council had bought 5 farms on their Western development area for their expansion, for development, as they call it. In other words, what that means is knock down the farm and build houses. Yeah. And they'd slightly overestimated the number that they needed. And there was this place called Lower Shore Farm that was not needed. And an organization called the Foundation for Alternatives in Urban Development, run by a guy called Stan Windass and another guy who worked for the council, Reverend Andrew Hake. And they had approached the borough council and said, can we use that farm for a short while? You've boarded it up, you're going to demolish the outbuildings. And they got a foot in the door, and they got some funding, and they got some volunteers. And for 3 years, they put cement down in areas where there hadn't been cement before. They put glass in shed windows where there hadn't been glass before. They had meetings about the first mention of WWOOF, of working weekends on organic farms, was mentioned here by Sue Coppard at Lower Shore Farm. The first mention of education otherwise, and an open door program on BBC Two in 1978 or 79.
I was going to ask you what sort of era are we talking about now? Are we talking about this?
This is the 1975 to 1979.
Right.
So through last 3 years of the 70s.
And when you say the first mention of WWOOF, are you saying the sort of the beginnings of willing workers on organic farms?
Absolutely. Sue Coppard has told me that she mentioned the idea of working weekends on organic farms over a cup of tea at Lower Shore Farm, and then took it to London and had meetings with people who then helped her set it up. And the same Dick Kitto, who was a warden at Lower Shore Farm for the foundation, set up Education Otherwise with others and got it on the BBC Two Open Door programme. And I said to my mother and my sister, I'm busy, I haven't got time, I'll go and look at it one day. And I wrote to the people who were here and said, oh, can I come and visit you? And they said yes. And by that time, the Foundation for Alternatives had moved on. They were setting up initiatives, and once they'd set up something that had started, they would move on to something else and hope that the people who they got involved would run the place. So it was a great idea, a great way of doing it. And when I came to visit, I remember knocking on the door and nobody answered. And I went round the back and knocked on it and nobody answered. So I walked around the place and there was a swamp around the back with nettles. And there was a Renault 5 in the yard with its eyes poked out and no tires on, and a chicken came out of it. So the place looked a little bit, I would say, run down. And I finally found 3 women sitting in the kitchen over a mug of coffee, and they said, "We're wondering what to do. We've run out of money. We're not quite sure whether we can get another lease." And I said, "But this place is fabulous. It's full of possibilities." And because it was in my boyhood locale, and because I could see a community spirit was already there and it was possible to grow it, I got very excited. And they said, "We normally take people on a 6-month trial and so on." But they said, you could come straight away." I said, "What? Really?" And anyway, within a couple of months, I had moved in. I was very excited.
Your timing was absolutely perfect. They must have felt like you've been sent from, sort of 3 women sitting there going, "What on earth are we going to do?" And then a bundle of energy comes in through the door.
Well, that's for you to say, Kirsten. In the long run, not everybody liked me. And you know what community living is like. It has its ups and downs. But in 1980, in March 1980, I came to Lower Shore Farm. And for 16 years subsequent to that, we lived in community. We lived fully, and we had the best time. We had 3 families and 3 single people, 13 or 14 people living in a very confined space and very small amount of land. And it was wonderful.
So just when you walked in and you've met those 3 women, did you know that this was it an established community? Had they set up as a community, or were they, how what was the setup at that time?
They'd been functioning for 3 years under a warden who I think was paid by the Gulbenkian Foundation and the Foundation for Alternatives, something like that. And they were effectively volunteers, but they got all their food and everything they needed. And they were also, now that the warden had moved on and left them to it, they were signatories to checks. So in effect, they ran this place, and their intention was to live communally, even though there was only 3 of them. That had been the spirit passed on to them by the warden. The idea was, even though he was, the way middle-aged men can be, in charge of a younger male and female volunteers.
Yes.
He actually said to me later, he was waiting for leadership to come along, which is an interesting and tricky thing in a community, because we all have different skills, and sometimes there are people who sit in meetings and want other people to make the tricky decisions or suggest the tricky subject. And so this idea of leadership it's a funny term, but we won't go into that now necessarily. But anyway, I remember him saying he was waiting for leadership to come along, and there was a woman who came along and was very strong. And what was interesting, that she was sort of squeezed out because of this particular kind of strength that she had. So, or that's the way I saw it anyway. And she confirmed that too. So it's interesting that, again, these are sort of discussions that have been had in many communities. How do we
Absolutely.
how
different
do we move on? Yeah, absolutely.
the difference in ways that things are structured. I know there's an article. I think it's an American author. It's not. It might be someone like Kat Kincaid, and they've written. I'm sure it's called something like the ecstasy and agony of a never-ending meeting or something. And it's this discussion about devolved.
And what's interesting about an idealistic, enthusiastic young community is that without realizing it, they're trying to reinvent the wheel.
Yes.
And do everything from scratch, not realizing that monasteries and nunneries and all sorts of utopian setups have tried it before. And if only they read and listened, they might not have to do everything from scratch. But there's something exciting about being pioneering and saying, those people got it wrong. We're going to do it our way. And it's tortuous, but it's also wonderful. That's what I would say about it. And what was interesting in our case was that it really was pioneering and exciting. And meetings in the early days, as I recall, were fun. And obviously this is all from my perspective, but they were interesting and exciting. And shall we put a gate post there? And, shall we have yoga? And shall we also have massage? Should they be together or should they be separate? So there were lots of exciting conversations. And shall we have goats or sheep? Goats are a pain in the arse. Oh, but we want goat's cheese, do we? I don't.
You don't want the goats eating all your veggies, do you?
That's right, ripping things down and so on. But what was wonderful was there was the energy of people in their 20s and 30s getting to grips with things. But what was interesting was that at that time we had no children, and the significant change took place, in my opinion, when we started having children, and when the principles and values by which you live are exposed, are revealed. So when you're single, or when you're just couples or single, you can mask. Your bedtimes don't matter to other people. But when you have children, and even your meal times don't matter. In other words, if you don't like a particular dish, that's fine. You can deal with it as an adult. But when you have children and you're cooking communally, if a child says, I don't like this food, and one parent says, but that's what's for supper, my darling, and another parent says, oh, you poor little thing, I'll make you something special. You've got division taking place. If it's bedtime and one parent says, it's bedtime, my little one, and another parent says, oh, you can stay up as long as you like. Or it comes to school and one parent says, it's school time now, and another parent says, what, my little darling, you don't want to go to school? That's fine.
Stay at home today.
And so you have all these values and principles that you hold dear, by which you want to live, that are suddenly out in the open and through your children. And that's when even though we had wonderful times with our children in community with 3 families, more and more the cracks appeared through the values that we had about childcare, child rearing, money, and all the other things that you could deal with when you didn't have children were now suddenly looming before you as significant. And life became tricky. And what's interesting was that, unlike, say, the Bruderhof, which had the dogma of Christianity to guide them, at least, even though they reckon that one of the things they say is every day is a challenge, we were truly reinventing the wheel. Somebody said, what holds you together? What religion or what politic? And do you know, the only answer I could find was work. In other words, to earn a living, we had to run a course or grow vegetables or something. And so we had to agree about work. So really, work ethic was our politic and was our glue and was our religion, and was what kept us together. And also gradually, we had similar musical tastes and we enjoyed similar things. But work really was what cemented the community.
So it does sound really organic. Like you do hear that some communities that take years to come together, they spend a lot of time, and it's not always successful. So I'm not suggesting this is a better model, but some communities, you do hear that they spend a lot of time kind of writing those types of things. What is our philosophy? How we, what do we believe in? And the Lower Shore Farm sounds like it was much more emergent, much more, in some ways, more creative and responding in the moment. Is that how how would you describe
No,
that?
that's a really good way of putting it. We were working it out as we went along. And one of the things we did was create a kind of statement of what we were trying to do. And we were flattered when another community in the south of England, without asking us, they sent us their leaflet, said, could you put this on the notice board? And it was virtually verbatim our expressions of learning to live and work together well, and all the stuff that we'd written through meetings and through discussion and through carefully choosing the words, they'd adopted. So we were flattered.
So they had taken the policy that you had written a number of years earlier.
Yeah. So which is a kind of compliment, actually, Kirsten, isn't it? That they'd been wrestling with their own words to try to define themselves, and had found that ours were okay, and ours did work for us. They worked really well. You know, money is always at the heart of these things. Who has the signatures to the checkbook? It comes down to that. And so we decided everybody should have that, which is another nightmare. So fraught with trickiness, but the wonderful economics of community living were constantly present. In other words, any man or woman only had to cook once a week or once every 8 days. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. We had one washing machine, and washing machines are well built, that washed clothes for 13 people. And so it was always working. And I'd go to these other people's houses and their washing machine wasn't on. I'd think, what's going on here? That polished white thing standing idle. And you know, when you had a birthday here, you didn't have to worry about inviting people. There would be 13 people who, even if they were pissed off with you about something you'd done the day before, forgot that and would sing happy birthday to you. And
I suppose if you've got 13 people, then you've practically got a birthday party, not every month, but you know, a very average ready-made party schedule.
Yeah.
So
lots of things come ready-made in the community that other people in the outside world have to strive for all the time. You know, commonly people have to cultivate a circle of friends. Well, at Lorshall Farm, we're overwhelmed with friendship, and we're very grateful for it, both by the community the people we live with. And now, actually, we're in a third chapter. So really, for me, chapter 1 was the Bruderhof, then a gap of almost 20 years in the real world, or the real world. I think this is the real world as well, but we will argue about that. And then chapter 2 was 16 years of communal living here, where we shared work and shared everything. And now we've had another chapter where the community, just like the Bruderhof, had a kind of schism, had a falling apart. And we were, to put it bluntly, we were ousted. we were outvoted. When I say we, I mean my wife and I, Andrea and I. And that was really unpleasant and really difficult and really sad. We've since made up with a number of the people who were part of the ousting procedure. And, you know, life's a tricky business and everybody does their best. And I think everybody, all of us, should have second chances, because very few people get up in the morning and think, do you know what? I'll do really bad things today. Most people get up and think, I'll do good things today, but they're a different way of doing good things, and they may not work quite as well as other people's, and that's why. But anyway, we left, and the people we left behind, I mustn't say this in bitter fashion, but they fell apart within 6 months, and the place fell apart, and we came back to keep it going, and decided not to be that kind of community again, because it had nearly ruined, it had nearly wrecked projects that we were working on, a play group and a kindergarten here, the Swindon Festival of Literature that we'd started, and so on. And so we are now a co-op, which is a kind of community. And what's interesting about that, Kirsten, is that a number of people who have known Lorshall Farm for many years have said, hey, do you know what? It feels more like a community now than it did before, which is interesting, because in paper documents, it's not a community; it's a co-op.
No,
but the communal spirit is alive and well, and I would say we're more what you might call a transient community now. In other words, Andrea and I and a couple of other people are the kind of stable custodians, but other people come. We've had people stay for 1 year, for 2 years, for 6 months, for 2 weeks, and it works. It works.
Sounds amazing. Can I, one of the things that we ask nearly all of our guests on the Diggers and Dreamers podcast is whether they have, I mean, it sounds to me like you have 1,000 things you could probably say, but some key points or things you've learned along the road, or something, if if you were talking to people who maybe were thinking about, I don't know, forming or joining their own community, what key learning or kind of nuggets of truth would you be able to contribute to that?
Oh dear, I'm one of those people who believes that irony is the saving grace for humanity. And I have a friend who suffers what Keats used to call melancholy, but we now call depression. And he said, he rang me up once and said, "Say that thing that makes me feel better." And I said, "What? What?" And he said, "That thing about utterly something." Oh, I said, "It's all utterly hopeless." He said, "That's it. I feel better now." And so when you say what key things are there, look, life's a really tricky business. We're spinning through space. We're not sure about anything. We know we have this thing called love feeling that is very strong and makes us care for people. But that's about it. How we can live and work together is going to be endlessly tricky. And the longest surviving communities, for better or for worse, have been and are religious communities. All the economic communities, Mennonites, Lauriston Hall, Findhorn, all of them have constant struggles. And the Bruderhof and monasteries have challenges and struggles, but they also have a rock-like stability that they can fall back on. Now, I don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, so I don't follow Christian principles. However, I love a candle at mealtimes. I'm mystified by most of life, but I think it's bloody wonderful. And so my answer to your 3 key points is, I haven't got 3 key points. I don't know. But I love living and working with people, especially on projects that have some meaning and some value.
Thank you, Matt Holland. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been really interesting to hear all about your journey in community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communard's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.